In the dark winter of 1943, Europe lay in chains. From the Channel to the Balkans, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, Hitler's armies ruled a continent of silence and fear. But across the sea, in England, a new kind of army was gathering, one unlike anything the world had seen. They came from every corner of the free world: Americans, Britons, Canadians, Poles, Czechs, Frenchmen, Australians, New Zealanders, mechanics, tankers, pilots, engineers, sailors. They spoke in different accents, prayed in different ways, but they all carried the same quiet promise: to return freedom to a continent that had forgotten what it sounded like. That promise was codenamed Operation Overlord. It was not just another offensive, it was a gamble that would decide the fate of the war: the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. And the man who had to make it happen was a quiet, steady American from Kansas, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower understood something that few generals did. He knew that in modern war, courage was not enough. To defeat Hitler's fortress, the Allies would have to turn chaos into order, to coordinate air, sea, and land forces so precisely that the entire invasion would move as one living machine. He called it the Great Partnership. The idea was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Thousands of tanks and trucks would have to land on 5 separate beaches, while bombers struck inland defenses, paratroopers seized bridges, and fighters hunted anything that moved on German roads. Every wave, every bomb, every radio signal had to fit inside a single 24-hour plan. The entire invasion depended on timing, and timing depended on the sky. From the start, air superiority was not a luxury, it was the foundation. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had spent 3 years fighting for control of the European skies. By 1944, they had it.
Thousands of Spitfires, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Typhoons filled the air every day. Bombers flew around the clock, turning the once invincible Luftwaffe into a shadow of its former power. But victory in the air alone meant nothing unless it could be joined to the steel on the ground. That connection began with the transportation plan, a quiet, mathematical campaign that preceded D-Day by months. Its goal? Isolate Normandy. Night after night, Allied bombers roared over France, striking rail junctions, bridges, and fuel depots. They weren't bombing cities, they were cutting nerves. The intent was not to destroy the enemy, but to paralyze him. Without railways, the German army could not move tanks or reinforcements to the beaches once the invasion began. Without fuel, its armored divisions would be trapped. By May 1944, the plan was working. Eisenhower's analysts calculated that German train traffic in northern France had dropped by more than 70%. Armored divisions were stranded hundreds of miles from the coast. When D-Day came, they would have to fight alone. Yet deception was as vital as destruction. Even as real troops trained in southern England, the Allies built an entire phantom army in the east, complete with fake tanks, inflatable trucks, and bogus radio transmissions. They called it Operation Fortitude. From the air, it looked real. German reconnaissance pilots saw thousands of vehicles parked in open fields near Dover. They heard radio chatter that sounded like preparation for an assault. To them, the invasion would come at Calais, the shortest crossing point across the Channel.
And that was exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. The illusion was so perfect that even on June 6th, after the real landings had begun, Hitler still kept the bulk of his panzer divisions guarding Calais, waiting for an invasion that never came. While deception misled the enemy, precision guided the Allies. In countless small airfields across southern England, pilots studied aerial photographs of the Normandy coast, every gun emplacement, every trench, every hedgerow mapped in detail. Navigators memorized landmarks, church steeples, rivers, crossroads. For the first time, a modern invasion would be planned not only by generals, but by the pilots above the battlefield. Aerial reconnaissance had given the Allies eyes sharper than any spies. They could see the beaches from the sky before the first soldier touched the sand. As spring turned to summer, England transformed into a giant armed camp. Roads filled with convoys of trucks and tanks. Airfields buzzed with aircraft and harbors brimmed with landing craft. Every village echoed with the sound of engines. Locals watched as columns of Shermans and Churchills rolled toward the coast, their tracks grinding the roads into dust. Pilots lived in temporary huts beside their aircraft, studying weather reports and flight plans. Tank crews slept inside their machines, surrounded by ammunition crates and ration tins. They knew something enormous was coming, but not when. Only a handful of commanders knew the exact day. They called it simply the day. On June 4th, the invasion was postponed. The weather was too violent: wind, fog, and rough seas. For 48 hours, the greatest armada in history waited on the English coast, engines idling, nerves fraying. Then, in the early hours of June 5th, a small window opened. Meteorologists reported a brief break in the storm, a single day of better weather before the next front rolled in. Eisenhower listened in silence. Every officer in the room knew that this was their only chance. If they delayed again, it could mean weeks of waiting, perhaps months. The Germans might discover the plan. Eisenhower stood, looked at his commanders, and said the words that would change history. "Okay, let's go."
By that night, the machine of Overlord was in motion. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 men prepared to cross the Channel. The invasion had begun, not on the beaches, but in the sky. As darkness fell, the first aircraft took off from English runways, long lines of C-47 Dakotas and Halifaxes carrying thousands of paratroopers. The men inside were silent, each one lost in thought. They checked their weapons, their harnesses, their watches. Below them, the English coast disappeared into black water. Ahead lay occupied France. The greatest gamble of the war was underway. The sky awakens. In the cold darkness of June 5, 1944, the skies over southern England came alive. Engines rumbled like distant thunder. Wings shimmered in the moonlight as formations of aircraft took off one after another, each heavy with men and hope. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were paratroopers, men who would fall from the sky to light the first spark of the invasion. 23,000 of them. American, British, and Canadian airborne divisions packed into hundreds of transport planes and gliders. Their mission was clear: strike deep behind enemy lines, destroy bridges, capture roads, block reinforcements, and hold the ground until the main force arrived from the sea. If they failed, the invasion would collapse before it began. The first wave crossed the English Channel in total darkness. Below, the sea rolled black and endless. Inside the planes, red lamps glowed faintly, casting long shadows on faces tight with fear. Outside, the night was a storm of flak and searchlights. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as the Armada crossed the French coast. Tracer rounds clawed upward, ripping the sky apart. By that night, the machine of Overlord was in motion. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 men prepared to cross the Channel. The invasion had begun, not on the beaches, but in the sky. As darkness fell, the first aircraft took off from English runways, long lines of C-47 Dakotas and Halifaxes carrying thousands of paratroopers. The men inside were silent, each one lost in thought. They checked their weapons, their harnesses, their watches. Below them, the English coast disappeared into black water. Ahead lay occupied France. The greatest gamble of the war was underway. The sky awakens. In the cold darkness of June 5, 1944, the skies over southern England came alive. Engines rumbled like distant thunder. Wings shimmered in the moonlight as formations of aircraft took off one after another, each heavy with men and hope. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were paratroopers, men who would fall from the sky to light the first spark of the invasion. 23,000 of them. American, British, and Canadian airborne divisions packed into hundreds of transport planes and gliders. Their mission was clear: strike deep behind enemy lines, destroy bridges, capture roads, block reinforcements, and hold the ground until the main force arrived from the sea. If they failed, the invasion would collapse before it began. The first wave crossed the English Channel in total darkness. Below, the sea rolled black and endless. Inside the planes, red lamps glowed faintly, casting long shadows on faces tight with fear. Outside, the night was a storm of flak and searchlights. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as the Armada crossed the French coast. Tracer rounds clawed upward, ripping the sky apart.
But the pilots pressed on. Radar beacons, codenamed Eureka and Rebecca, guided them toward their drop zones. At precisely 12:15 a.m., the green lights flashed. And then the sky began to rain men. Parachutes bloomed like ghostly flowers against the night. The roar of engines mixed with the crack of gunfire. In fields, rivers, and hedgerows, paratroopers hit the ground, scattered, disoriented, often miles from their targets. Many landed in flooded marshes, some drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed directly among German positions and fought from the moment they touched the earth. But despite chaos and confusion, small groups began to form. Using hand signals, flashlights, and instinct, they rallied and moved toward their objectives. Bridges were seized, roads were blocked, communication lines were cut. At Sainte-Mère-Église, American paratroopers fought to secure the first French town liberated in the invasion. To the east, British glider troops captured the Pegasus Bridge, a vital crossing over the Caen Canal. They had landed silently, in the dark, mere yards from the target. By dawn, the bridges were in Allied hands. The way inland was open. These men of the airborne forces were not alone. Above them, the rest of the sky belonged to the Allies. Wave after wave of bombers thundered toward the coast, striking at coastal batteries, bunkers, and radar stations. Each target had been studied for months, each strike timed to protect the men below. The coordination was breathtaking. From command posts in southern England, operations officers directed hundreds of squadrons by radio. Weather stations fed constant updates. Navigation planes dropped flares to mark paths through the clouds. Even as bombs fell, fighters circled above the landing zones to guard against any surviving Luftwaffe interceptors. This was not chaos, it was choreography. The dance of steel and sky had begun. At 3:30 a.m., glider waves began to arrive. Towed by heavy bombers, they glided silently toward the dark fields of Normandy, carrying jeeps, artillery, and small tanks.
Landing was brutal. Many gliders broke apart on impact, crushing men and cargo alike. But the survivors crawled from the wreckage and immediately began their tasks. By dawn, dozens of key crossroads and gun emplacements had been taken. German communications were in disarray. Commanders had no idea how many enemy troops were behind their lines or where they had come from. For the first time in 4 years, the occupied countryside heard something it had forgotten: the sound of foreign aircraft dropping men not to destroy, but to liberate. As dawn broke over Normandy, the full magnitude of the air operation became clear. More than 800 aircraft had carried paratroopers through storm, flak, and confusion. Nearly 500 gliders had landed, many wrecked, but their missions complete. The airborne forces had succeeded in their impossible task. They had turned chaos into control. The beaches now had a shield behind them. And as the first light touched the horizon, another storm gathered on the sea. 5,000 ships, each packed with men, tanks, and hope, began to move. The invasion of Europe was about to begin, and the coordination between sky and steel was about to be tested in the fire of battle. Far above the channel, bomber formations flew at 10,000 feet. Their engines droned endlessly, their bellies filled with bombs meant for the coastal defenses. Each pilot had his orders, exact timing, exact targets. The aerial bombardment would begin minutes before the landings. Its purpose was not only destruction, but confusion, to blind the defenders, to make them believe the entire coast was under attack.
But there was a risk. Too much bombing, and the beach would become a cratered wasteland impossible for tanks to cross. Too little, and the defenses would remain deadly. Precision mattered more than power. The balance between air and armor would decide everything. At 5:30 a.m., the first explosions lit the horizon. The roar of artillery and bomb blasts rolled across the water like thunder. On every ship, soldiers looked toward the French coast, a long, dark line under the morning sky. And then they saw it. The flash of guns, the columns of smoke, the silhouettes of landing craft moving toward the shore. The air war had cleared the way. Now the war of steel was about to begin. The first light of June 6, 1944, crept slowly over the English Channel. The horizon glowed pale gold, then bled into gray. And out of that gray, an armada appeared. More than 5,000 ships, stretching as far as the eye could see. Destroyers, landing craft, battleships, transports, a sea of steel carrying the hopes of the free world. Each vessel carried men who had been silent for hours. Some prayed. Some checked their rifles again and again. Some simply stared at the horizon, where the coast of France waited under the guns of the enemy.
They had trained for this for years. Now everything depended on coordination, the dance between sky and sea, between bombers above and tanks below. The largest invasion in human history had begun. At 6 a.m., the air erupted. From the east came squadrons of Allied bombers, hundreds of aircraft sweeping over the beaches at low altitude, dropping payloads meant to shatter German defenses. Behind them, fighters roared through the mist, strafing bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests. Each attack was guided by precise timing. Every pilot had his map, every squadron its minute. The bombardment had to end the moment the landing craft touched shore. Too soon, and it would fail to clear the way. Too late, and it would destroy the very men it was meant to protect. Above the water, the sky burned with tracer fire. Below, the sea boiled with landing craft, plowing through waves under the cover of smoke and chaos. The Allied fleet moved forward in 5 great waves, each bound for a code name that would be carved into history. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. At Utah Beach, the Americans landed first. Strong currents pushed many craft off course, but the mistake saved them. They landed in a lightly defended sector. By luck and coordination, the tanks that reached shore were able to support the infantry immediately. Amphibious DD tanks, Shermans wrapped in canvas flotation skirts, churned through the surf. Their propellers buzzed like bees, their turrets already trained on the sand. As the ramps dropped, the tanks rolled into the shallows and opened fire on the German bunkers. Behind them, the infantry advanced, crouching behind the moving armor. It was the first great test of the partnership between steel and sky.
Above the tanks, thunderbolts and typhoons screamed down, unleashing rockets and cannon fire on any target the tank commanders marked by radio.
The air was a symphony of destruction, precise, deliberate, devastating. Within 3 hours, Utah Beach was secure, but Omaha was different. Here, the storm had turned the sea into a trap. The DD tanks launched too far from shore. Most sank beneath the waves, dragging their crews with them. When the landing craft reached the beach, the infantry found themselves alone, pinned under withering machine gun fire from the cliffs above. The air bombardment, meant to destroy the defenses, had fallen too far inland. German bunkers were untouched. The beach became a killing ground. Bodies floated in the tide. Men lay flat in the sand, unable to move. For hours, chaos ruled Omaha. Then, slowly, coordination began to return. Navy destroyers, ignoring orders, moved dangerously close to the shore, so close that their hulls scraped the seabed. They fired directly into the German defenses at point-blank range. Above, Allied pilots, guided by smoke signals from the beach, dove through enemy fire to hit the remaining strongpoints. Tankers who had made it ashore began firing up the cliffs, while infantry crawled forward under the cover of that fire. Piece by piece, Omaha began to move. By midday, the first tank had reached the top of the bluff. Behind it came hundreds of exhausted, mud-covered soldiers. The impossible beach had been taken.
Farther east, the British and Canadians fought across Gold, Juno, and Sword. There, the tank-air coordination reached its peak. At Juno, Canadian Shermans equipped with bulldozer blades smashed through beach obstacles, while Spitfires and Typhoons provided overhead support. Every time a tank commander called in a target, a gun nest, a machine gun pit, a line of barbed wire, within minutes a rocket barrage came screaming down from the sky. At Gold, British engineers used specialized tanks, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, to clear mines and obstacles. Flamethrower tanks incinerated bunkers, mine flails beat the sand ahead of the infantry. The airmen above worked as their invisible allies, striking deeper targets, cutting supply routes, ensuring that no German reinforcements could reach the beaches. And at Sword, where German counterattacks threatened to break through, British armor and Typhoons combined to halt them in their tracks. The cooperation was exact, practiced, and deadly. Each tank advance was shadowed by the roar of jet-like fighter bombers above. By late morning, 4 of the 5 beaches were secure. The 5th, Omaha, followed soon after. By nightfall, the Allies had landed over 150,000 men and thousands of tanks, trucks, and vehicles. The beaches of Normandy, once Hitler's fortress, were now in Allied hands. But victory on the sand was only the beginning. Beyond the dunes lay the bocage, a labyrinth of hedgerows, stone walls, and narrow lanes. Perfect ground for ambushes, terrible ground for tanks. The next phase of the war would be a battle not of beaches, but of fields, where the coordination between air and armor would decide the fate of the breakout. Yet on that first night, as the guns fell silent and the sea receded, one truth was clear. The impossible had been achieved. Through discipline, precision, and the perfect harmony of men, machines, and the skies above, the Allies had done what the world thought could never be done. They had stormed a continent and lived.
As darkness fell on June 6th, pilots returned to their bases in England, their fuel tanks empty, their nerves shattered. Ground crews met them with cheers, then silence, as they counted the missing. On the beaches, tankers dug in among wreckage and smoke, knowing the counterattack would come at dawn. The coordination between air and armor had saved the invasion, but now it would have to hold the line. The battle for Normandy, the true test of steel and sky, was only beginning. The morning after D-Day smelled of diesel, smoke, and salt. The beaches of Normandy were secure, but barely. Every inch of sand behind the dunes was now a living machine, a tangle of supply trucks, engineers, tanks, bulldozers, and men digging foxholes into the soft earth. The sea still glimmered with wreckage, sunken landing craft, twisted metal, bodies floating among oil slicks. Yet above it all rose the steady hum of engines. C-47 transports, fighters, reconnaissance planes, an endless stream crossing the channel, carrying the pulse of the Allied invasion. The world had changed overnight. But Hitler's army was far from defeated. The German high command had been stunned by the landings, yet by dawn on June 7th, panzer divisions were already on the move. From Caen in the east and St. Lo in the west, steel columns rumbled north. Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, the pride of the Wehrmacht. They would strike the beaches and throw the invaders back into the sea. The Allies knew they were coming, and this time they were ready. In the hedgerow country beyond the beaches, tanks rolled through narrow lanes hemmed in by ancient earthen walls. Every intersection, every farmhouse, every line of trees could hide an ambush. The land was beautiful, green, lush, alive. But to those who fought there, it was hell.
German tanks waited behind the hedgerows, their guns trained on the gaps. Every time an Allied tank moved forward, the countryside seemed to explode. What followed was a battle of coordination, not between armies, but between elements, between air and ground, between armor and the pilots who guided death from above. Allied tankers learned to fight in tandem with their airmen. When a panzer column was spotted, they radioed their coordinates to the nearest forward air controller. Men crouched with signal flares and maps, often only a mile ahead of the lines. Within minutes, the sky would fill with the growl of engines. The Typhoon fighter bombers came first, British-built monsters with rocket rails under their wings. They dove through clouds at terrifying speed, unleashing 8 high-explosive rockets that could split a tank in half. Behind them came the Thunderbolts, American P-47s, big, rugged, unstoppable, strafing roads, supply lines, and convoys. To the men below, it was salvation. To the Germans, it was annihilation. Every attack was followed by the same thunderous silence, the sound of the air being sucked away after a rocket strike. One British tank commander, watching a Typhoon obliterate a Panther ahead of him, whispered over his radio, "Thank God for the boys in the sky." By mid-June, the Germans realized that their tanks could not move by day. Every road was watched. Every bridge was under fire. Even a single plume of dust could bring an airstrike. Panzer commanders began moving only at night, covering their tracks with camouflage nets and smoke. But the Allies had an answer for that too. The Mosquito and the night-flying bombers, guided by radar and reconnaissance. There was nowhere to hide. The war had entered a new phase, one dominated not by numbers, but by coordination, precision, and timing. In the British sector, the fight centered around Caen, a city of stone and ruin. Montgomery's troops, supported by air power, fought block by block, street by street.
The Typhoons circled overhead like hawks, striking German strongpoints with uncanny accuracy. Whenever Allied tanks became trapped, the pilot swooped in, rockets, cannon bursts, then silence. At night, Pathfinder aircraft dropped flares over the battlefield, turning darkness into day. Tank commanders watched the sky as much as they did the ground, knowing that their survival depended on that invisible partnership above. Farther west, the Americans fought through the hedgerows toward St. Lo. Each field was a fortress, each lane a trap. The enemy's anti-tank guns fired from hidden positions, knocking out Shermans one after another. The infantry couldn't advance. The armor couldn't maneuver. The battle ground to a halt. And then, the Americans changed the rules. They began coordinating every tank assault with airstrikes.
Pilots flew so low they could see the mud on the tank hulls. They dropped smoke bombs to mark friendly positions, then turned their guns on the next hedgerow over. The effect was devastating. Panzer grenadiers were blown out of their positions. Machine gun nests vanished in fire and dust. For the first time, tanks and aircraft fought as one. In late July, after weeks of grinding attrition, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. The plan was simple: destroy the German front lines with an air bombardment so massive that the enemy's defenses would collapse in hours. On July 25, 1944, the sky darkened. More than 3,000 Allied aircraft gathered over a 10-mile front, flying fortresses, liberators, marauders, bombers as far as the eye could see. They came in waves, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on the German lines near St. Lo. The earth shook. Fire and smoke rose like storm clouds. When the bombing ended, the tanks moved in. Columns of Shermans, Churchills, and Cromwells advanced through the wreckage, their tracks grinding over shattered ground. There was no organized resistance, only stunned survivors and burning armor.
The German front broke apart. The Allies surged forward. In less than a week, they'd punched through the line that had held them for nearly 2 months. The open country lay ahead, and with it, the road to Paris. The success of Operation Cobra was not luck. It was the result of relentless coordination, the perfect harmony between air and ground, forged through trial and blood. Every pilot trusted the men below. Every tank commander trusted the eyes in the sky. They had learned to move as one, to fight as one, to win as one. And from that unity came momentum, the unstoppable force that would carry the Allies across France, through Belgium, and into Germany itself. As July gave way to August, the air over Normandy shimmered with victory. Everywhere, the same phrase echoed through Allied radios: "Steel and sky together." It wasn't just a phrase, it was a creed. Because on the ground, a tank without air cover was a target. In the sky, a pilot without a ground marker was blind. But together, they were invincible. The partnership that began on the beaches had become the engine of liberation. The dust over Normandy hung for days. The earth was blackened, the air thick with the smell of cordite and oil. But for the first time since D-Day, the front lines were moving. Operation Cobra had cracked the German defenses wide open. The Allies had broken free of the hedgerows, and now, finally, the battlefield belonged to the armor. Columns of Shermans thundered down open roads, their turrets swinging, engines roaring in chorus. Beside them, half-tracks carried infantry through villages reduced to rubble.
Overhead, the sky never slept. From dawn until dusk, the air hummed with Allied aircraft. Spitfires patrolled the clouds. Mustangs and Thunderbolts struck deep behind enemy lines. And bombers, hundreds of them, shattered the bridges, railways, and crossroads that the Germans depended on. Every movement on the ground was shadowed by wings. Every advance was guided by the eyes above. The coordination was absolute. When German armor tried to regroup, the radio codes went out instantly. Panzer Movement Grid 34B, request immediate strike. Minutes later, the sky screamed. Typhoons diving low, firing rockets into the tree line. The explosions tore the earth apart, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. To the soldiers on the ground, it felt like a storm of iron answering their call. By late July, the German army was in retreat. But it was no simple withdrawal. Hitler had ordered his generals to counterattack, to strike west, to cut the Allied advance in half and drive it back to the sea. The result was chaos and opportunity. At Falaise, the German 7th Army and Panzer forces found themselves trapped between two advancing Allied fronts. From the north came the Canadians and Poles, from the south, the Americans. Between them lay a narrow corridor, the Falaise Pocket, a killing ground of smoke, mud, and metal. Here, the partnership of steel and sky would reach its most devastating form. The Germans tried to escape through the corridor under cover of darkness, but the Allies had learned to fight the night. Overhead, the sky never slept. From dawn until dusk, the air hummed with Allied aircraft. Spitfires patrolled the clouds, Mustangs and Thunderbolts struck deep behind enemy lines, and bombers, hundreds of them, shattered the bridges, railways, and crossroads that the Germans depended on. Every movement on the ground was shadowed by wings. Every advance was guided by the eyes above. The coordination was absolute. When German armor tried to regroup, the radio codes went out instantly. Panzer Movement Grid 34B, request immediate strike. Minutes later, the sky screamed. Typhoons diving low, firing rockets into the tree line. The explosions tore the earth apart, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. To the soldiers on the ground, it felt like a storm of iron answering their call. By late July, the German army was in retreat. But it was no simple withdrawal. Hitler had ordered his generals to counterattack, to strike west, to cut the Allied advance in half and drive it back to the sea. The result was chaos and opportunity. At Falaise, the German 7th Army and Panzer forces found themselves trapped between two advancing Allied fronts. From the north came the Canadians and Poles, from the south, the Americans. Between them lay a narrow corridor, the Falaise Pocket, a killing ground of smoke, mud, and metal. Here, the partnership of steel and sky would reach its most devastating form. The Germans tried to escape through the corridor under cover of darkness, but the Allies had learned to fight the night.
Radar-equipped aircraft scoured the roads. Searchlights and tracer rounds turned the sky into a lattice of fire. Every time a convoy tried to move, the air erupted. Bombers dropped their payloads. Fighters strafed the roads. The trapped divisions disintegrated under the storm. Tank columns were reduced to twisted wreckage. Vehicles burned in rows that stretched for miles. By dawn, the Falaise Pocket was a graveyard of steel. The destruction was total. More than 10,000 German soldiers lay dead. Tens of thousands more were captured. The escape routes were gone, cut apart by coordination. By the end of August, the road to Paris lay open. The German army in France had ceased to exist as an organized force. Its tanks were destroyed, its fuel exhausted, its will shattered. The Allied spearheads raced forward, their movements choreographed by the unseen rhythm of air command. Every column of tanks had its guardians in the sky. Every advance was cleared by aerial reconnaissance before the first tread moved. It was not just victory. It was precision warfare on a scale the world had never seen. In every village they passed, the French came out of hiding. They lined the roads with flowers, tears, and flags pulled from cellars. They climbed onto tanks, cheering, weeping, thanking the men who had fought for them. The pilots flying above could see it all, columns of armor rolling through crowds of liberated civilians. They banked their wings in salute, white contrails glimmering in the sunlight. For the first time in years, the sound of engines over France meant freedom. On August 25, 1944, Paris rose in revolt. The city had waited too long, suffered too much. As German forces prepared to withdraw, the Allies moved in from every direction. American and Free French armored divisions entered the city under the cover of air patrols. Every avenue echoed with the rumble of tanks and the cheers of the liberated. When General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division reached the center of Paris, the bells began to ring. From the Notre Dame to Montmartre, the sound carried across the city, a song of deliverance, of defiance, of rebirth.
It would shape every battlefield that came after. In the early days of the invasion, the idea of coordinating tanks and aircraft had been radical. Commanders distrusted what they couldn't control. Pilots and tankers spoke different codes, lived in different worlds. But Normandy changed that forever. There, amid the sand and hedgerows, necessity forced cooperation. Radios crackled between ground units and airfields. Forward air controllers rode in jeeps with antennas reaching to the sky, guiding the thunder with hand signals and colored smoke. Pilots learned to read the land, to distinguish friend from foe by the shape of a tank turret or the glint of sunlight on armor. It was no longer just an army and an air force. It was one organism, one mind made of many. And that unity became unstoppable. In the months that followed, the lessons of Overlord were written to every plan, every strategy. Operation Market Garden, though flawed, used air-ground coordination on a vast scale. Gliders, paratroopers, tanks, and bombers woven into one daring assault. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied air forces grounded, and for days the ground troops fought blind. When the skies cleared, the difference was immediate. Fighters and bombers returned, and the German advance began to collapse. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the relationship between tank and pilot was seamless. The sky no longer watched from above, it fought beside the ground. But the real legacy of Overlord wasn't just in victory. It was in evolution. The principles forged in 1944 would become the foundation of modern warfare. The concept of close air support, born in the smoke of Normandy, became standard doctrine. Armies learned that mobility without cover was suicide, that every tank, every convoy, every foot soldier needed eyes in the sky.
But the essence never changed. Air and armor working as one. The men who fought at Normandy could never have imagined the technology their courage would inspire. They had no satellites, no drones, no computers. Only instinct, trust, and timing. And yet, they achieved what no army had done before: total coordination. In the decades that followed, historians would study every movement of D-Day, the timing of the air raids, the path of the landing craft, the positioning of the tanks, and realize that this was more than a battle. It was a revolution in how humans wage war, a transformation from brute force to orchestration, from chaos to choreography. The sky had become the shield and the sword of the ground below. Still, for those who were there, it wasn't doctrine or destiny they remembered. It was the sound. The steady heartbeat of engines across the dawn. The shriek of rockets diving toward the shore. The hiss of tank treads on wet sand. The pilots and tankers never saw each other's faces, yet they shared the same sky, the same danger, the same faith. They were bound by invisible threads of smoke and steel, by radios and courage,
by the single belief that coordination could conquer chaos. And it did. When the war finally ended in 1945, many of those who had fought in Normandy went home and never spoke of it again. But their legacy endured in every field manual, every training flight, every armored brigade that followed. The lessons of D-Day became the DNA of modern militaries. Even peace was shaped by them, by the understanding that control of the sky meant survival on the ground. The invisible partnership of 1944 still echoes today in the hum of jet engines, in the whir of rotor blades, in the silent watch of satellites. It began with men in muddy uniforms and propeller planes, and it became the defining truth of warfare.
And yet, beyond the tactics and the strategy, the story of Operation Overlord remains something more. It is the story of courage, not just to fight, but to cooperate, of pilots who trusted the tankers below, of soldiers who looked up and believed that someone was watching over them. It is the story of 1,000 moving parts, men, machines, elements fused into one purpose: to take back a continent, to end tyranny, to reclaim the future. And they did it not through strength alone, but through unity, through the perfect balance of steel and sky. The wind over Normandy is quiet now. The beaches are peaceful, the fields green again. But if you stand there at dawn, you can still imagine it. The distant thunder of engines, the low hum of aircraft beyond the clouds, the ghosts of tanks rolling toward destiny. For one brief, furious summer, the world was held together by men who believed that precision could overcome fear. And they proved it true. In that harmony of courage and coordination, they didn't just win a battle. They changed the very meaning of war. Steel and sky, forever intertwined.
Beneath the shadow of a dying moon, a kingdom trembles. Torches flicker against cold stone walls, banners hang still, and somewhere in the distance a clock strikes midnight, the hour when kings dream of glory or fall to ruin. Tonight, the crown will weigh heavier than ever before. Tonight, loyalty will bleed. Tonight, a king will be betrayed. He was once loved, adored by his people, feared by his enemies, a ruler born not from greed, but from promise. His name was King Alden of Thaloria, and his rise was the story of hope after war. For 20 years he held his kingdom together by will alone, mending wounds carved by endless battles and bitter dynasties. But power, like gold, tarnishes in the wrong hands. His court had grown silent with secrets, smiles hid daggers. The air itself seemed to whisper warnings that the king refused to hear. It began 3 nights before the solstice, when a black-feathered raven landed upon the battlements with a sealed letter bound in crimson wax. The sigil was broken. The message read, "Your crown glitters brighter than your throne can bear." Alden burned the letter, but its ashes clung to his fingers like prophecy. That evening, the feast hall was filled with laughter, wine flowing like blood, music echoing from golden walls. Yet the king's heart was heavy, for across the table, his most trusted friend, Lord Seren, would not meet his eyes. Seren, the general who had once saved the king's life in the siege of Dravik, now sat quietly, his hands clasped around a goblet, watching the firelight dance across its rim. He had loved the king once, but envy had a way of rewriting old loyalties. Whispers had reached him, rumors that the king planned to name another heir, a foreign-born child raised in secrecy. His pride cracked like old marble. He had built this kingdom with his own sword, and now, he believed, he would be cast aside. And so, in the silence between laughter and the next cup of wine, he made a choice that would end an empire. The night stretched long. The rain came soft and endless. The king retired to his private chamber, a hall of marble and flame. He laid aside his crown, its jewels glimmering faintly like eyes in the dark. He stood before the window, watching lightning crawl across the horizon. It was then he felt it, the presence behind him. "Saren," he said quietly, without turning, "you should have been asleep." "I should have," came the answer, calm, trembling, and sorrowful. "But kings should listen more closely to the wind." A flash of steel, a whisper of betrayal. And yet, even mercy makes enemies. He rose from the table and walked toward the balcony. Rain met him like cold needles, soaking through his robe of crimson and black. Below, the city stretched into the darkness, rooftops glistening, alleys glimmering with pools of water. Somewhere out there, he knew, the whispers were spreading, that the court was turning against him, that his trusted friend, his brother in all but blood, had grown cold. "Seren," he whispered, as though the night itself might answer. The name drifted away on the wind. Lord Seren, the man who had once saved his life at the siege of Dravik, who had marched beside him across 10 years of war, who had stood with him at his coronation, hand over heart, tears in his eyes. And yet, something had changed. Alden felt it first in the council chamber, that quiet pause when Seren no longer looked to him before speaking, that absence of warmth in a glance, the space between words where friendship used to live. The signs were subtle, but kings learn to listen to silence. Behind him, the fire cracked. A figure moved in the doorway, cloaked, hesitant. It was Sir Cale, the captain of the royal guard. "My king," he said softly, kneeling. "There are whispers again about the general." Alden turned, rain still dripping from his hair. "What do they say this time?" "That he has met with merchants from the southern isles, and with men who do not bear our crest." I sighed. "Do you think I do not know?" Cale hesitated. "If it is true—" "If it is true," Alden interrupted, his voice low, "then the man I trust most plans to destroy what we built together. But if it is not, and I strike too soon, then I become what I swore I'd never be." He walked past Cale, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Keep watch tonight, but no arrests, no steel, only eyes." Cale bowed deeply. "As you command." When he was gone, Alden returned to his table. The letter he had begun earlier caught his eye. He lifted the quill once more, and the ink bled across the parchment as he wrote. "To the heir of my heart, whoever finds these words, remember, power without mercy is only another form of fear." He signed it, simply, Alden. Then, from the window, a shadow moved in the rain. Far below, in the courtyard, Lord Seren stood in the storm. His armor was dark, unmarked, his cloak clinging to his shoulders like night itself. He stared up at the tower where Alden's chamber burned faintly with light. Behind him, a figure emerged from the fog, a hooded woman carrying a torch. Her voice was cold. "It must be tonight." Seren did not turn. "He was my brother." "And you were his weapon," she said. "He would have discarded you soon enough. The throne does not share." Seren closed his eyes. For a moment the sound of rain was louder than his heartbeat. Then he spoke, softly, almost to himself. "I told him once that I would follow him anywhere. I suppose that includes the edge." The woman smiled faintly. "Then step over it, my lord." The torch went out. Only darkness remained. Back in the tower, Alden felt a chill sweep through the room, the sudden instinct that comes before disaster. He turned to the door. Nothing. And yet somewhere deep within the stone walls, a footstep echoed. Once. Twice. Slow. Deliberate. The hour of betrayal had begun. The torches along the eastern hall flickered and hissed as the wind slipped through the cracks in the shutters. The palace was a labyrinth of whispering stone in wet air, each passage echoing with the faint murmur of servants long vanished to their quarters. King Alden walked the length of his chamber once more, every step slow and measured. The rain outside had turned to a steady rhythm, as if the heavens themselves were counting down the hours. He could not shake the feeling that someone was watching. From far below came the clang of iron, faint, distant, and wrong. He froze. "Cale?" he called softly. No answer. Only the low moan of the wind. He crossed to the table, lifted the candle, and stepped into the corridor. The flame trembled in the draught. The walls, carved with ancient sigils of Thaloria's founding kings, seemed to lean closer, their shadows stretching and twisting with every flicker. He moved past the chamber of maps, shelves filled with scrolls detailing every inch of his realm. How many nights had he spent here dreaming of peace? He remembered those early years, the rebuilding after the wars, the treaties, the laughter that once filled these halls, back when the sound of boots in the dark meant nothing more than the changing of the guard. Another clang, closer now. He turned toward the stairwell, candle held high. "Cale!" A shape appeared below, armor gleaming faintly. Relief flickered through Alden's chest, but as the figure stepped into the light, his breath caught. It was not Cale. The soldier's face was hidden beneath a hood, his blade drawn. The king took a step back. "Do you know what you're doing?" he asked. The hooded man hesitated, his voice strained. "Forgive me, my liege. Orders." "From whom?" A silence. Then, barely above the rain, "From the general." Alden lowered the candle, its light painting deep lines across his face. He could see now the tremble in the man's hands, the conflict in his eyes. "You have a family?" "Yes, my lord." "Then go to them. Tonight." The man's mouth opened, closed. He looked away, lowered his sword, and stepped aside. The king walked past him, leaving the candle burning on the stair. By the time the soldier dared to look back, Alden was gone, a shadow swallowed by the corridor. In the great hall below, the feast banner still hung from the rafters. Their colors, once bright red and gold, had darkened in the damp. The long table was cleared now, the remains of the evening's wine and bread swept into buckets by servants who dared not speak. Seren stood at the far end, staring into the cold fireplace. His armor was polished, his sword belted tight, his hands clasped behind his back. The door opened softly behind him. "You should not linger," said the hooded woman from before, her voice a whisper against the stone. He did not look at her. "He will come. He always faces what hunts him. And when he does, then Thaloria will have a new dawn. You mean you will have a new crown." Her laugh was soft, cruel. "Do not pretend this is for the realm." His jaw tightened. "You think me a villain. Perhaps I am. But I have watched him give mercy to those who would burn our cities. I have seen him spare traitors who would have slit his throat if given another chance. Peace built on weakness is only a lull before ruin. The woman stepped closer. Her torch cast his shadow across the wall, tall, trembling. Saren turned sharply, eyes flashing. Enough. A voice came from the doorway. Yes, enough. Alden stood there, wet from the storm, his crownless head haloed by the flickering light. The hall seemed to still itself around him. "Leave us," he said to the woman. She hesitated, then vanished into the darkness beyond the columns. The two men stood facing each other, one in armor, one in plain royal robes. The air between them was heavy, like a bowstring drawn to breaking. "So it's true," Alden said. "You've chosen this path." Serene exhaled slowly. "You left me no choice." "There is always a choice." "You made it for me," Serene said, "when you sent soldiers to guard the southern border instead of my lands, when you spoke of naming a new heir, a child of unknown blood raised far from Thaloria. You took from me the future I fought to build." Alden's voice was quiet. "You fought for me once, not for crowns, not for thrones, for the people. The people need strength. They need mercy. They need survival." Serene's voice broke, echoing through the hall. "Do you think love feeds them? Do you think forgiveness keeps enemies from our gates?" Alden stepped closer, the candlelight catching the faint tremor in his hands. "You mistake mercy for weakness, old friend. You mistake fear for strength." Something in Serene's eyes flickered. Pain, regret, then anger. "You call me friend while knowing what must happen tonight." "Yes," said the king, "because I know what it means to lose one." The thunder rolled again. The hall shook with its sound. For a long time, neither man moved. Then slowly, Alden turned his back. He walked toward the long table, placing both hands on its edge. "If you must do this, then do it as you did in war, face to face." Serene's voice was a whisper. "Forgive me." Alden closed his eyes. "I already have." The blade drew from its sheath, the sound of betrayal, sharp and final, and above them the storm broke open, lightning painting the windows white. Far above, in the watchtower, Captain Cale returned from his patrol to find the corridors empty, the guards gone. He saw the door to the great hall standing open, the torches burning low. He descended the stairs, every instinct screaming. He reached the threshold just as the thunder cracked again, and in its flash saw the impossible. The king on his knees, a dagger buried deep. Saren standing before him, shaking, eyes wet with fury and grief. "Why?" Cale's voice shattered the silence. Saren looked up, as if waking from a dream. "Because mercy kills kings." Then he dropped the blade and fled into the rain. Cale ran to his sovereign, catching him before he fell. Alden's blood was warm, bright against the marble. His breath came in shallow whispers. "Listen. Do not hate him. Not yet. The realm must live. Promise me." Cale nodded, tears falling. "I swear it." Alden's eyes softened. "Good. Then Thaloria may yet see morning." And with that, the just king of Thaloria breathed his last. Outside, the storm raged on. A storm still clung to the edges of the sky when dawn came. Clouds hung low, gray and swollen, drifting across the pale horizon like tired ghosts. The rain had stopped, but the scent of it lingered in the stones, in the tapestries, in the blood that stained the marble of the great hall. The palace servants moved through the corridors, with heads bowed and torches dimmed. None spoke above a whisper. The word had spread, carried from trembling lips to trembling ears. The king is dead. And yet no bells tolled, no drums announced the morning. The city below remained still, as if afraid to breathe, until the storm's last echo vanished. In the upper chamber, Lord Seren sat alone. His armor lay discarded beside the throne, his cloak damp and torn from the night's escape. The fire before him burned low, its orange glow dancing across his hollow eyes. He had not slept. He did not try. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Alden's face, calm even in death, and heard the final words that had broken him more than any blade ever could. I already have. Forgiveness, even at the end. He pressed a hand to his forehead, breathing slow. The hall around him still smelled of smoke and iron, of sorrow and rain. Outside, the ravens had gathered on the spires, dark feathers glistening against the gray. The door opened behind him. Captain Cale entered, his steps heavy, his eyes red from sleeplessness. "My lord," he said, voice hoarse, "the council waits. They demand to know who will wear the crown." Seren did not turn. "Then tell them what they already know." Cale's jaw tightened. "I cannot. Not until I know what you intend to tell the people." Seren looked up slowly. "Tell them the truth, that the king is gone. Tell him he died defending the realm." Cale's eyes flickered. "Defending? From whom?" Seren murmured, turning back to the fire. "From himself, from weakness." A silence stretched between them. Cale stepped forward. "You killed him." Seren did not deny it. "I saw you. I watched him forgive you even as you struck him. And still I stayed my blade because he begged me to. But do not mistake my silence for loyalty." Seren's voice hardened. "Then what are you waiting for, Captain? Draw your sword and finish what the storm began." Cale's hand hovered near his hilt, then fell. "No, not yet. You will answer to something greater than me." He turned and left. The sound of his boots faded into the dark.
Hours later, the council gathered in the Hall of the Nine, the oldest chamber in Thaloria's palace. Candles lined the walls, their flames shivering in the cold air. At the center stood the throne, empty, its gold filigree catching the faintest light. Seren entered last. He had washed the blood from his hands, dressed in the black of mourning, and carried himself with a stillness that made the lords avert their eyes. He walked to the throne, but did not sit. Instead, he stood before them, the flicker of candlelight reflected in his gaze. "The king," he said quietly, "is dead." A murmur rippled through the hall. Shock, grief, fear. "Who threatens us? What danger could strike within our own walls?" one of the ministers asked, trembling. Seren's gaze cut through the crowd like cold steel. doubt, division, those who would mourn louder than they serve. A chill moved through the room. He placed an arm on the armrest of the throne. We have lived in softness. We have mistaken kindness for safety. But the world beyond our borders sharpens its knives even now. From this day forward, Thaloria will be strong again. And then he sat. The throne seemed to groan beneath him, as though the weight of his guilt had mass. The council bowed, one by one, some out of fear, some out of necessity. Seren said nothing more, only stared at the fire burning in the brazier before him, as though it might speak the forgiveness he would never again hear. Night fell once more. The rain returned, lighter now, like a whisper against the glass. Seren wandered the corridors alone. He passed the great hall, now cleaned and silent, the floor scrubbed free of blood, yet forever marked. He paused there, listening. Somewhere above, a door creaked open. A draught carried the faintest scent of myrrh and candle smoke, the scent of Alden's chambers. He climbed the stairs slowly, hand tracing the stone. When he reached the room, the fire inside had burned low. The crown lay on the table, gleaming faintly in the dim light. And beside it, the letter Alden had written the night before. Ink smudged, but still legible. To the heir of my heart, whoever finds these words, remember, power without mercy is only another form of fear. Seren sank into the chair. His fingers brushed the edge of the parchment. For the first time since the dagger fell, his breath caught in his throat.
He whispered, barely audible, "I did this for you, for the realm, for peace." But even he could hear the lie in his voice. The window rattled as the wind pressed against it. For an instant the candle flame flared, and in that light he thought he saw a shadow standing at the balcony, tall, regal, still. Alden. Seren blinked, and the shadow was gone. He rose, heart hammering, staring at the rain-slick glass. Outside, the city was silent. The storm had passed, yet thunder still rolled faintly beyond the horizon, as if the heavens refused to forget. The new king bowed his head. His voice was a whisper swallowed by the dark. "Then neither will I." The torches burned lower that night, their flames swaying like uneasy spirits. The palace had not known sleep since the king's death, and even the silence seemed restless, filled with the echo of footsteps long gone. In the courtyard, the rain had gathered into thin pools that reflected the trembling lights of the high towers. And there, beneath the balcony of the royal chambers, a group of guards stood whispering. They spoke of a shadow, of a voice that had called their names in the wind, of a figure in white standing beside the gate, a figure who vanished when approached. One of them, a young sentry named Rowan, swore by his sword that he had seen the late King Alden himself walking through the mist. He said the king's eyes were not filled with rage but sorrow, as if he still watched, still waited. By dawn, every servant in the palace had heard the tale. By noon, the city beyond the walls whispered it too. The king has returned. He walks when it rains. In the throne room, Lord Seren sat surrounded by advisors, maps spread before him. His voice was cold, clipped, as though the words themselves were weight. "The eastern border has fallen quiet," one minister said. "But the merchants speak of unrest in the capital. People gather at the shrines. They're praying not to the gods, but to the memory of King Alden." Seren's hand froze above the parchment. "Pray to him." "Yes, my lord. They call him the just king." A murmur rippled through the council. Seren's jaw tightened, his knuckles pale against the edge of the throne. "Let them pray," he said finally, "but not in the streets. Send soldiers to the shrines. Disperse them if they gather. There will be no saints born from treason."
The room went still. No one dared speak further. That night, the dream returned. Seren saw the great hall again, the storm raging outside, the torches bending in the wind. He saw Olden standing before him, dressed not as a king, but as a man, unarmed, unafraid. "Why do you haunt me?" Seren whispered. Olden's voice was calm, the same voice that had ruled a kingdom through gentleness. "Because you still believe you were right." Seren shook his head. "I did what you could not. I saved the realm from your weakness." Alden's figure stepped closer. "And what did you save it for? So you could wear its chains instead of its crown?" Seren looked down. The floor beneath him had turned to water. The reflection of the throne stared back at him, warped and trembling. Olden's voice faded into the storm. "Mercy does not make kings weak, Seren. It makes them unforgettable." And then silence. Seren awoke drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. The crown lay beside his bed, glinting faintly in the moonlight. He turned it over in his hands, and for a heartbeat thought he saw his reflection smile back at him. By the following week, strange things began to happen within the palace. The grand mirror in the Hall of Swords cracked down the center, though no one had touched it. The royal hounds refused to enter the great hall. Candles burned out all at once during council meetings, as if snuffed by unseen hands. The servants spoke of it only in whispers. The curse of the just king. Captain Kale, who had once stood loyal to Olden, began keeping watch outside the throne room each night. When Seren confronted him, Kale merely said, "I serve the crown, but I remember the man who wore it before you." The words stung deeper than any blade. The room went still. No one dared speak further. That night, the dream returned. Seren saw the great hall again, the storm raging outside, the torches bending in the wind. He saw Olden standing before him, dressed not as a king, but as a man, unarmed, unafraid. "Why do you haunt me?" Seren whispered. Olden's voice was calm, the same voice that had ruled a kingdom through gentleness. "Because you still believe you were right." Seren shook his head. "I did what you could not. I saved the realm from your weakness." Olden's figure stepped closer. "And what did you save it for? So you could wear its chains instead of its crown?" Seren looked down. The floor beneath him had turned to water. The reflection of the throne stared back at him, warped and trembling. Olden's voice faded into the storm. "Mercy does not make kings weak, Seren. It makes them unforgettable." And then silence. Seren awoke drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. The crown lay beside his bed, glinting faintly in the moonlight. He turned it over in his hands, and for a heartbeat thought he saw his reflection smile back at him. By the following week, strange things began to happen within the palace. The grand mirror in the Hall of Swords cracked down the center, though no one had touched it. The royal hounds refused to enter the great hall. Candles burned out all at once during council meetings, as if snuffed by unseen hands. The servants spoke of it only in whispers. The curse of the just king. Captain Kale, who had once stood loyal to Olden, began keeping watch outside the throne room each night. When Seren confronted him, Kale merely said, "I serve the crown, but I remember the man who wore it before you." The words stung deeper than any blade.
Seren stood before Alden's tomb that evening. The crypt was cold, the air thick with the scent of iron and stone. He stared at the inscription carved into the marble. He ruled not with fear, but with faith. The words mocked him. He knelt, pressing a hand against the smooth stone. "You were loved," he whispered. "Too loved. They remember your smile, not your mistakes. They forget how mercy weakens a kingdom." The silence answered with the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Then, behind him, a sound. Footsteps. Slow. Bare. Seren turned sharply, but no one was there. Only the torchlight flickering against the wall, stretching shadows like long, reaching hands. He drew a breath. "You're not real," he muttered. "You're gone." But as he turned to leave, the flame nearest him flared violently, and on the wall behind the tomb a shadow appeared. A crown, a man, and eyes that seemed to look directly into him. Seren stumbled back, heart pounding. The torch fell from his hand and clattered across the stone floor. When he looked again, the shadow was gone. Only the echo of a voice remained, faint, carried by the air. "A kingdom built on blood cannot forget its ghosts." Days turned into weeks. The council grew restless. The people whispered louder. And the new king, haunted and sleepless, began to rule with iron instead of wisdom. Those who spoke Alden's name aloud vanished by morning. The shrines were burned. The guards doubled. And yet, every time it rained, someone swore they saw the figure of a man standing on the palace balcony, watching, always watching. And far beyond the palace walls, in the distant hills, a candle was lit each night by the hands of a farmer who once fought under Alden's banner. Word spread in the darkness, quiet, steady, unstoppable. The just king will return. The rain did not stop for 7 days. It came down in sheets, washing the color from the city, soaking banners and bones alike. And in that endless gray, whispers turned to voices, voices to vows. They called themselves the Order of the Dawn, farmers, soldiers, and scholars who still spoke King Alden's name with reverence. They gathered in hidden cellars, lit candles beside bowls of water to reflect the symbol of a crown, not of gold, but of light. They said the old king's spirit walked among them, that he guided their dreams,
that his forgiveness had become a weapon sharper than any blade. And at the center of it all was Cale, the captain who had once guarded both kings. He no longer wore his armor. His hair was unkempt, his eyes shadowed. But when he spoke, his voice carried the calm of purpose. We were ruled by a man who believed mercy could bind a nation, and now by one who believes fear will keep it whole. Which do you think will last longer? The crowd before him murmured. Cale looked to the dripping ceiling as if Alden himself listened from the rain. The just king may be gone, he said softly, but his kingdom isn't finished speaking. Inside the palace, Saren's world was shrinking. He avoided the windows. He spoke to no one unless the words were commands. Every sound, the scrape of armor, the whisper of wind through the tapestries, made him turn his head sharply. At meals, he sat alone. The food went cold before he touched it. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps pacing in the hall outside his chambers, always stopping when he approached. He had begun locking every door behind him. One night, unable to bear the silence, he called for his old tutor, a wise, trembling man named Eris. Eris had served the royal family since before Alden was born. His back was bent now, his beard white as frost. He bowed low before the king. "You taught us both," he said, his voice uneven. "Tell me, was I wrong?"
The old man's eyes lifted, sorrowful. "You were not wrong to love the realm, my lord, but you were wrong to believe it must be ruled by fear." Saren's fists clenched. Fear is all they understand. Alden's mercy blinded them. Eras hesitated, then said quietly, "No, my lord, it opened their eyes. That is what you could not forgive." Saren rose so suddenly that his chair fell back. His voice echoed across the marble chamber. "Leave me!" The old man bowed once more and withdrew, his shadow fading into the torchlight. When the door closed, Saren was alone again, except for the whisper that followed. "He's right." He froze, turned. Alden stood there, or seemed to, pale, translucent, his ground glowing faintly like fire seen through fog. "You were always afraid of shadows. Now you've become one," the ghost said softly. Saren's breath caught in his throat. "You're not real." "Neither is your peace," Alden murmured. And as quickly as he appeared, the ghost vanished, leaving behind only the sound of rain against the window pane. At dawn, Cale's men moved. They struck swiftly, seizing the southern gates, cutting through the watchtowers before the city could stir. By the time the guards had realized what had happened, the streets were already filled with voices crying, "For the just king!" Saren woke to the sound of bells, not of mourning, but of uprising. He stormed into the war hall, his cloak half-fastened, eyes blazing. "Where are the generals?" he demanded. "They're gone, my lord. Half the garrison has joined the rebellion." "Then the other half will burn with me," Saren growled. Every man still loyal." The palace erupted into chaos. The banners of gold and crimson that had once hung proud over Thaloria now dripped blood and rain. From the walls, Saren watched the torches in the streets below, thousands of them, flickering like stars fallen to earth. He knew Cale was down there somewhere, and part of him, very deep beneath the armor of guilt and rage, almost felt relief. If the rebellion killed him, perhaps the ghost would finally be silent. At midnight, the battle began. Arrows streaked through the storm, torches shattered, and the air filled with the hiss of steel on steel.
Seren fought beside his guards, his sword flashing in the lightning, his face streaked with rain and ash. He was no longer a king, but a cornered man, and cornered men fight hardest. For hours the storm and battle blended into one. The palace gates shook, the rebels pressed forward, and then, through the clash and thunder, Seren saw him. Kale. The captain stepped from the ranks, soaked to the bone, his eyes fierce yet sorrowful. The soldiers around them fell back, sensing the weight of what was about to happen.